From the first moment I looked into his eyes, I felt like I'd known him forever. It was a feeling that first time of absolute peace and certainty. One of those moments that comes along so rarely, seems so elusive, and is over before you can even try to hold on to it. Though I still feel closely connected to my son, inextricably linked really, it sometimes feels that even from the very first day of his life, I've been forced to practice letting Dalton go. This was a freak accident, a tragic confluence of unlikely events, any one of which in combination, altered by a fraction of a second, might have changed everything and made it better or worse.
The accident was a year ago today. It was about 7:30 in the morning, and I was standing back on the steps watching Dalton and Ross as they were going to walk to school.
I usually get here about 7:10, and I'm a person that I have to have everything laid out for the morning and know where I'm going, and so I was in, as usual, early.
Really, only about a month before had I let him start walking by himself. He said to me one day, "Mom, I'm literally the only kid in school whose mother still walks him."
The 7:30 bell had rung, and that was the time when the children are allowed to come to the classroom. And
so they walked down to the end of the driveway, and Dalton was standing here, and Ross was standing next to him, and Dalton leaned in to check traffic. And it's really a good thing he was still looking that way, because a van came, moved to try to avoid another car coming up the street, and a car was parked on the street. And the rearview mirror evidently hit Dalton here.
With the room next door having an outside door, someone came bursting in the door and said, "A child has been hit. Call 911."
I didn't even see that the van had hit him at first. He sort of moved back, and then I cannot remember. I don't have any recollection of the next few seconds.
First thing that ran in my mind was, I have two students that walk to school every day. They live right up the street.
I saw him laying face down in the street, and I ran out, and I turned him over, and I sat in the street holding him.
I ran out my side door, and when I looked up the road and I saw all the traffic stopped, immediately in my mind I'm thinking, that's one of my students.
I told Ross to run inside and get the phone to call 911.
I saw like a van and stuff, and I heard a lot of ambulances.
Sarah, she sits kind of around me, and she's in my class.
I thought, oh no, please don't let it be Dalton, because it was right in front of his house.
I began to run up the road at that point because I'm thinking, I need to be there, I need to help.
It took the ambulance 20 minutes to get there because there was a shift change. And with the shift change, there's an ambulance sitting up there, but there were no people.
Those minutes just drug. It seemed like, it seemed like hours.
It was the most horrible, long 20 minutes of my life.
I whispered a prayer right then and there that, the Lord would just touch him, that I didn't know what else to do.
I didn't know till later that in the ambulance he did stop breathing, and they had to bag him as they took him to push air into his lungs as they took him to the first hospital where they stabilized him before they transferred him to the trauma unit.
I was wondering why there were all the cars up the street when I was walking in, and they let me in a weird door they usually don't let me in. Dylan, he's faster than me at running. He was in my class, I think, 2 years ago. So I was wondering what was happening until I heard somebody get hit by a car. And then they thought it was me at first in my class, until a person came in with the walkie-talkie, and I heard that it was Dalton Smoot that had been hit. And I was feeling really bad, scared about what happened to him.
As I was walking back here to the school, there was I don't know whether it's an EMS worker, a firefighter, a first responder person is what I'll call him, but he said, "Do you know that little boy?" I said, "Yes, sir, I did." And he said, "It doesn't look good." He said, he wasn't responding.
Miss McGee, our assistant, had to teach us for about an hour until Miss Daniel came back and she was crying.
When I walked in here, there were so many faces that were just tears dripping off. And I thought, I'm going to be okay now, but I lost it again. And, I'm standing there, I couldn't speak to the children for the tears that were dripping off my face. And we just cried together for a while.
Once she told the class that Dalton got hit, there was like this, because we were talking about like what had happened and who we thought was up there and everything, and like everybody just stopped and just sort of didn't do anything and just like sounded like you couldn't, like if it, like nobody's heart was going or anything.
I was getting ready to go. I was at work getting ready to go to court and got a phone call from Miss Grubb at the school, and I think she said, "This is Miss Grubb at James Elementary School," and for some reason I thought it must be Southwest calling that maybe Melanie's bus had a wreck or something.
Aunt Susan. She's my aunt, and she is nice, and she's Melanie's mom.
And then when she started talking about Dalton, she said Dalton had been hit by a car, and I think she said car, and that she said, "Your sister needs you, Mary needs you." And I just completely broke down and had to give the phone to somebody else.
You want to do something, when you hear news like that.
Steve Jarrett. Steve Jarrett went with me to see a movie.
And the only thing that occurred to me was to try to the extent that I could, gather information and be a source of information to people around here. I think just about my first thought was of Lisa Napoli.
I saw that there was an email from Steve Jarrett.
Lisa Napoli. She lives in New York, and we went to New York to see her.
And I know Steve. I've known Steve for years, and he's a sweet, dear person, but it's not like we communicate regularly. And occasionally we'll start a conversation, but we hadn't talked in a long time. And what was really unusual, besides the fact that Steve was writing to me, was that in the subject line it said Dalton. I got up and I walked back and forth, and I just started sobbing so hard. I was like, I can't believe that this happened. And I tried to imagine how you would feel. I couldn't imagine how you must feel. So I walked back and forth, and I sobbed, and then I wanted to hit something, and I just sat back down and wrote back to him and thanked him for
Was Dalton okay? How bad was it? I didn't know anything.
Karen. She's my friend Davis's mom. She cooks when I spend the night at Davis's, and she's really helpful.
Not knowing anything, I think the not knowing was the hardest because I did not know any details. I didn't know anything.
Well, I especially wanted them to know since Mom and Daddy weren't there. And it was very hard because we couldn't get in touch with them, and I knew it would be very difficult telling them and them being that far away, but they had to know and they had to get there because we just didn't know how things were going to turn out.
And then the hospital chaplain approaches me, and I just remember my heart sinking and thinking, oh my God, I don't want to know what this man is coming to tell me. Actually, he came and said, Mary wanted me to tell you that they are going on over to Baptist Hospital. I was still having mixed emotions because I thought, okay, if we're going to Baptist, what little bit of knowledge I had of that hospital, I knew that, that people with very bad injuries go there.
Dalton had lost consciousness as soon as he was hit by the van. At first, we didn't know if he'd live or die.
His face was very distended, and at first they thought that he had broken his jaw. They thought his neck might be broken, and they kept him in the neck brace, and they were pretty sure he had broken his arm, and they knew that there were 2 fractures in his lower leg, tib-fib fractures in his leg.
The most serious injury was a closed head wound that left him in a coma for 3 days, and he was on a respirator for a day or two right after the accident. It would be much later before we could know for sure whether long-term effects of his brain injury might alter his personality or diminish his cognitive skills. This was not the first major threat to Dalton's health and well-being, but in fact the third. Prior to his birth, I had pregnancy-induced hypertension, and Dalton was delivered by emergency surgery 28 weeks into my pregnancy. The procedure was necessary to save my life, but his 2-pound birth weight and a slew of complications after delivery kept him in the neonatal intensive care unit for 4 months and 2 days.
On September 28, 1992, at the age of 4 months, he came in. The first time I got to see him, he was 6 pounds, 11 ounces.
Dr. Kirk. Well, he's mostly my doctor, and he helps me out from whatever, like, sickness I have.
You know, the biggest challenge was the fact that he made it out of the nursery, I think. That was, you know, Dalton did so well after he got out of the nursery. You know, I guess the biggest thing was just letting him grow up, and compared to other children with his amount of prematurity, he certainly did better than expected.
Then, at age 2.5, just when all the residual effects of his premature birth seemed to have been overcome, Dalton was diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis.
In September 1994, when he presented with his rash, see there that we had done a lot of blood work. We had decided that we were dealing with a systemic form of juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. With Dalton's form, it essentially affected every organ system. Unfortunately, for his young years, was again really a life-threatening disease.
He went through years of intense pain and itchy rashes when the disease was active, generally without complaint.
I don't itch very much.
Finally, the disease subsided. For 2 years, he had been in remission. And then came April 30th, 2002.
Whether we're in our 30s or 40s or 50s, most of us have never dealt with anything Dalton's had to deal with twice before. And now he's had a third major event in his life that, you know, he shouldn't, by all rights, should never have had to have suffered through. And I think that was my first response. And it was, you know, rather than, you know, how is he or what's happening, is just why.
Things changed so much. I remember it being kind of like a roller coaster that, you know, it's one thing, then you hear, well, you know, okay, he has this head injury, or he has this, or no, he doesn't have this, or maybe this is because of this.
You know, when somebody says it's serious, the first thing that you think of reflexively, I think, is it going to be fatal? And nobody really knew.
I knew he could die. I don't remember thinking definitely that he would die.
So somewhere in the back of your mind, you start the very beginnings of preparing for that.
One of my boys said, "Miss Daniels, he's gonna die." And I sat there for a moment, and immediately I wanted to say, of course he's not. And then I got to thinking, what if he does? And I had to deal with the reality of that right then and there, and I began to tell the children, there's only one person who controls life and death, and I can't answer that question.
I felt really upset. Melanie, she is my cousin, and she's in my family. I was scared. You know, I didn't know really what to think. I wasn't sure if he would be okay or not.
Did you think I was going to die when I was asleep for 3 days?
What? He was in a coma. Oh my.
Did you?
When I got in to see Dalton, I came away actually encouraged, because you know, one imagines all sorts of things, and what I saw was a child who was obviously hurt, injured, but he only appeared injured. He didn't appear broken.
Dalton's father and I separated and divorced when he was 4 years old. Dalton doesn't remember us all living together. I think his father blamed me, at least at first, for the accident, And I kept expecting him to lash out at me at the hospital, but he didn't. We really never talk about things except the logistics of Dalton's schedule or, ironically, about work, about projects like this one that he shoots for me. We took separate shifts at the hospital. I was there from morning to evening, and he was there overnight. The days at the hospital after Dalton got hit were reminiscent of the routine we had established 10 years before when Dalton was in neonatal intensive care. Even then, his father and I were seldom with Dalton at the same time until the day we took him home. I asked Dalton's father if I could interview him for this film, but he chose not to participate in that way.
I was overwhelmed at the outpouring for Dalton and the family.
I remember Karen was just wonderful, how she had food and she coordinated.
She was there every day at the hospital and dealt with everybody and took all the phone messages and just took care of everything that I couldn't take care of.
It meant a lot that Lisa came and spent time with Melanie because Melanie needed that time, and they made some awful concoction. They were going to bake something from scratch, and we had to try to eat it.
My friend Susan brought lunch that first week, every day brought lunch to me and my family.
So many friends came by, so many people called and expressed their thoughts and that they were thinking about y'all. And
I remember my friend Candace bringing a blanket and a pillow and a basket full of stuff you need at the hospital.
And it really puts your faith back if you ever have any doubts about mankind or anything. I really was just so touched by that.
I couldn't really talk to people on the phone. I couldn't really handle that, but the email was something that I could do, and that was very comforting to me.
You know, it was tough, and I know as a parent it had to be a million times tougher.
Women I know who have children, men too, parents, that's what they said over and over again. They'd come to the hospital, they'd stand with me by his bedside, and they'd say, "This is my worst fear."
You feel guilty too, in a way. It's strange. You feel guilty for coming away there going, you know, I'm going back to my safe, happy home, and my family's okay. And you're thankful, but you feel really guilty, and you really get a true sense of how precious life really is and how lucky you are.
When Lisa recounted hearing about the accident from our mutual friend Steve Jarrett, she sobbed. The tears came easily but didn't diminish as she described getting on a plane and coming down to the hospital a few days later. When she interviewed me, she asked me why I was so controlled in my responses, why I wasn't acknowledging the full range of my emotions. Maybe I was cried out by then. I cried for the first day, even when I thought no more tears could possibly come. I cried when I drove to and from the hospital. I cried when people did nice things for me, and there were a lot of those. Crying was a necessary release. But mostly, I was calm at the core of my being, even when the emotions circling that core were swirling with an intoxicating power. That's what I think it means to be strong. To hurt deeply, but know you'll survive.
I waited and waited to see him again, and just thought about him probably 99% of the time when he was in the hospital.
This one's from Dylan Carter, get better, to Dalton, very soon, and he says, not get better, and then he has an X through, and he says, get better, and then he has checks.
I remember it was a real turning point when his classmates sent him cards, and he wanted them all read to him. And even though he was still kind of struggling and still agitated at times and having cramps and in pain, that's the first time he really, that laugh came back, that laugh he has.
This one says, hope you feel better, and they drew me a pod racer. But that pod racer won't go because it doesn't have the electric mark through it. Dalton, get well soon, devoted, amazing, likable, too kind, obedient, nice.
Active, silly, sweet.
I love his personality exactly the way it's developed.
He has one of the biggest imaginations I know of, and we can always play anything we want to outside. And we like playing video games too, because we're both good at them, and we like playing with each other.
A best friend is someone you trust and that never lets you down.
I sort of had a sense that he wouldn't die, but then until he came out of the coma, what you don't know, what becomes really scary after you realize he's going to live, is whether or not he's going to be the same.
Anytime you see mental status changes and you realize that, yeah, after concussion you can act really goofy.
Thinking about the possibility that he could be different in terms of his personality or his cognitive skills or, all of that was very, very difficult.
And, so often it's sort of an acute change. The kid in the ER is acting bizarre, but, once they sort of sleep it off and the next day it's, everything's back to normal. And, when it wasn't quite back to normal the next day or the next day or the next day.
Coming out of a coma is a process. A week after speaking his first word, Dalton was still agitated and confused. Even so, doctors believed that familiar surroundings would help him recover faster and decided to send him home. When Dalton came home, he was still very disoriented for some time, and he was not comfortable being around people. It was several weeks after the accident that it was Mother's Day coming up, and when he realized this, he talked to my sister.
He wanted very badly to go out and get something for Mary. And of course, there was just no way that was possible. But he really it would upset him that he would not have something for Mother's Day for Mary. I asked him what his mother's favorite color was, and he said chartreuse. And I said, well, how about if I get her something that's chartreuse? You want me to look for some jewelry or earrings or something? He said, yeah, but it had to be chartreuse.
She ran all around town, I guess, and found a pair of chartreuse earrings, and
I brought them back and wrapped it and gave it to him so that he would have it to give to her on Mother's Day.
He pulled the box out and extended it to me, and I just knew, that's Dalton.
You feel pretty invincible, huh?
Yeah. I challenged.
Do you know what invincible means?
I challenged a van, and it couldn't take me.
Do you know what invincible means?
Cannot be beaten.
Is that how you feel?
No one's that way. No human person.
Dalton really seems untouched by the accident, which is strange because everyone else who is close to him has been affected profoundly by it.
I suspect that it's largely because the most emotionally wrenching part of the whole experience he wasn't consciously present for. We all went through that. He really didn't. He had the hard part because he had to do the physical healing, but the emotional trauma that we all recall, he wasn't conscious for.
Maybe that's another reason to make this film, so that he has a sense of the larger scope of what happened.
We miss you. We can't wait to see you. Okay.
What are the special blessings in your life?
Okay, we're cutting this part out too. It's just getting into my personal life here.
In the months since the accident, have you seen any changes in Dalton or changes in me?
Not really in Dalton. He's pretty much the same as he was before. You're a little more protective of him than you used to be.
Do you think it changed you as a person?
No.
But you think it did change me as a person?
No, yeah. Overprotective. Paranoid and possessed. And obsessed.
Even after Dalton came home, I would still be very nervous in parking lots or when he wasn't right with me.
Mary and our grandmother and Dawson and his friend Ross went to La Fiesta, and after we finished and we were getting in the car, Dawson and Ross were out near the road playing, and there's this car that came up and it looked like it was going to hit Dalton, and Mary got really upset about it, and after we got home, she just sat in the car and she cried.
Even after Dalton was home and things were ostensibly back to normal, whatever that means, I had to deal with the fact that I worried about him more than before. I did have times that might be described as actual anxiety attacks. It was like all of those what-ifs that parents carry around inside their heads all the time in the background had suddenly come to the foreground for me, and it has been very difficult to try to shift focus and return them to the background. I started asking myself why I was so afraid sometimes when my son was just fine. Why couldn't I just let go now, like I had when he was a preemie, and when his juvenile rheumatoid arthritis was active, and when he was in a coma? Why couldn't I trust him and trust myself and just have faith?
Good boy, that's awesome.
Since then, I've been practicing letting go, reminding myself to have faith and trusting that I can handle whatever might happen. It's hard sometimes, but since then I have felt better. Every morning I let him go. I watch him walk across the street to catch a ride with Ross to middle school. Every morning, at the moment he reaches the curb and looks both ways and starts to cross Potter Drive, I hold my breath until he reaches the other side. That's when I feel like a new day really begins, when he reaches the other side. And then I try to make the what-ifs shift from the focal point of my awareness to the background of my mind so I can get on with my day. My anxiety is not as intense as it was, and I suppose it will continue to diminish. But I doubt that things will ever be quite the same as they were before Dalton got hit.
I feel like Dalton and I have grown up together. I mean, he started in my practice when I was pretty new at this, and he's been a tremendous. I should put him down as continuing medical education because, so many times when I look at things, if I see a rash with adenopathy, I instantly think of Dalton. And when I see my premature babies coming in from the nursery, I keep thinking, no matter how bad this looks, it's not as bad as Dalton. And it makes it easier for me to reassure people and to use Dalton as the positive role model. I just hope that I never have to deal with another head injury like Dalton, so I can say, I had this patient named Dalton Smoot, so I would just soon let that be the only one I have to deal with in my career. So I'm leaving that up to you. And Dalton.
Dalton, how do you feel about me making this documentary?
You're obsessed with it. I mean, you think it's such a big deal. It's just, you're filming us talk. I mean, wow.
Can you tell me you love me?
I love you. We're cutting that part out, too.